About 20 years ago, I agreed to house sit for a family friend of a friend in Warrandyte, Victoria. I was in my early 30s, looking to make some extra cash, and the idea of a few quiet days in a peaceful suburb seemed perfect. Warrandyte was a far cry from the relatively subdued streets of Box Hill where I usually lived. I wasn't used to the quiet or the isolation, but I figured I could use a break. The house was nestled at the end of a long driveway on a tree-lined street with very few neighbours in sight. It had a rustic charm, typical of the area, surrounded by bushland and offering a view of the Yarra River. The owners showed me around before they left for their holiday, giving me a set of keys and a quick rundown of the house's quirks. Everything seemed normal at first. The first couple of nights passed without incident. I enjoyed the tranquility, noting how different it was from the more settled environment of Box Hill. I spent my evenings reading in the living room, occasionally glancing at the large windows at the darkening bush. But by the third night, things started getting strange. I was in the kitchen, making a cup of tea, when I heard a noise upstairs. It sounded like something heavy had fallen to the floor. I ignored it at first, thinking it was just the house settling or perhaps an animal outside. But then it happened again. The same distinct thud. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way upstairs. Each step creaked underfoot, the sound echoing in the stillness of the house. I checked the rooms one by one, but everything was in its place. I tried to shake off the unease as I returned downstairs, just trying to chalk it up to my not being used to such country quiet. That night, as I lay in bed, I was startled awake by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. They were soft but unmistakable, moving closer and closer to my door. My heart pounded in my chest as I listened, frozen with fear. The footsteps paused right outside my door, then continued down the hall. I didn't dare move until the first light of dawn crept through the curtains. The following day, I tried to dismiss the incident, attributing it to the house's age or maybe my overactive imagination. But that evening, things escalated. As I was preparing dinner, the TV in the living room suddenly turned on by itself, blaring static at full volume. I rushed in, fumbled for the remote, and managed to turn it off. This incident left me shaken, but I tried to laugh it off, blaming the power surge or a faulty remote. The most unsettling event happened a few days later while I was taking a bath. The house was quiet, the warm water relaxing me after a long day. Suddenly, the temperature in the bathroom dropped drastically. I could see my breath condensing in the air. Then, I heard a whisper, so faint it was almost inaudible. It was like someone was standing right behind me, murmuring in my ear. I jumped out of the tub, wrapped myself in a towel, and fled to the bedroom where I stayed under the covers till morning. I considered leaving, but I didn't want to abandon my responsibility without a good reason. However, the final straw came on a quiet Sunday afternoon. I was in the kitchen again, this time making a sandwich. Without warning, the cabinets began to shake, and the plates inside started to rattle. The lights flickered, and I heard a loud crash as a picture frame fell off the wall. Before I could react, a cabinet door flew open, and dishes started flying out, smashing against a counter and the floor. The air filled with the sound of breaking glass, and a faint, almost mocking whisper. I stood there, paralyzed as the chaos unfolded around me. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The house fell silent, but the damage was done. I packed my things that night. I called the homeowners the next morning, apologizing profusely and citing a family emergency. To my surprise, they seemed understanding. They didn't ask too many questions, and I found myself wondering if they knew more about the house than they had let on. It's been nearly 20 years, and I still think back to that week in Warrandyte. Sometimes, it's better not to ask the questions you don't want the answers to.
When I was a young boy living in Australia, I was a very light sleeper. Very sensitive too. If someone entered my room whilst I was asleep, they would wake me up, even if they were trying to be quiet. I would also somehow know whether it was my mum or dad or one of my two sisters. I mean, as soon as I woke up, I would know exactly which family member was in my room. Twice I was woken in the middle of the night, and my gift failed me. I don't recall how young I was at the time, but I was easily under 10 years of age. The first time I woke up and opened my eyes, I was looking straight into the face of a figure leaning over me. I say face because it was leaning over me, but truth be told, I couldn't see a face or make out any distinguishing features at all. It was just a dark shape leaning over my bed. I do not believe it was my father, although he was a big man, and this figure leaning over me was large as well. It just didn't feel like my father. My reaction at finding a stranger leaning over me in the middle of the night was immediate and frantic. I grabbed my teddy bear, yanked the covers over my head, and I burrowed down to the foot of my bed. If it had been my father checking on me, I'd like to think he would have responded to this reaction by letting me know it was him and seeking to calm me down. But there was no such fatherly reassurances that night. I distinctly remember the next morning asking my mum if she or dad had come into my room to check on me. I know they used to do that, but it was never anything more than opening my door and peeking in, which would still wake me up. This was someone who had entered my room and been leaning over me with their face barely a foot or so from mine. And they hadn't been a family member. A year or two later, I'm unclear on my exact age at the time. I'm 38 now, so we're going back probably a good 30 years or so. This night, I was again awoken in the middle of the night. When I woke up, I could sense something standing at the foot of my bed, staring at me. Again, if either of my parents had been checking on me, they would have done nothing more than popped their head in the door. But this thing was standing at the foot of my bed, and it didn't feel right. Oddly enough, despite there being a street light right outside my bedroom window, and despite having excellent night vision, my room was pitch black and I couldn't see a thing. But I knew someone was there in the darkness. I could feel them, and it terrified me. I have since spoken with other people who have had visitors in the night. People I personally know and trust. And they've all been able to describe their visitor, their features, clothing, everything. They've also told me that while they were a little disturbed to wake up and find someone watching over them, that they also felt calm and at peace. Like somehow they knew their visitor meant them no harm. My midnight visitors were dark apparitions that scared me half to death. I was never harmed, but these were not peaceful experiences. Not at all.
Finding a rental in suburban Victoria that was actually affordable seemed like a miracle. My two housemates and I, all in our early 20s and juggling part-time jobs with the university, couldn't believe our luck when we found a charming house at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. It was suspiciously cheap for the area, but we chalked it up to our good fortune, it being slightly run down, and a landlord eager to fill the place quickly. We moved in during the midst of an unusually warm summer. The house had a dated but cozy feel, with worn carpets and faintly creaking floorboards that we wrote off as part of its charm. It wasn't long before we started to notice some oddities. The first night while we were unpacking in the living room, we heard footsteps running up and down the hallway. We dismissed it as the house settling. Maybe it was the old pipes. But the footsteps continued every night, always around the same time, around 2 a.m. My room was the one at the end of the hallway, so I was often the last to hear the footsteps before they faded away. One night I decided to stay up to see if I could catch whatever or whoever was causing the noise. I sat in the living room, lights off, with only the glow from my laptop for company. Right on cue, the footsteps started. Light, rapid steps, unmistakably human yet not aligning with anyone's presence. As they approached the living room, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air grew cold, and I heard them stop just short of the doorway where I was sitting. I looked up, but there was nothing there. Just darkness and an overwhelming feeling of being watched. We laughed it off the next day, but a sense of unease lingered. Then came the touches. It started with Claire, one of my housemates. She'd been studying at the kitchen table and suddenly felt a light brush against her shoulder, like someone lightly running their fingers just to get her attention. She'd whip around expecting to see one of us, but the room would be empty. Over time, Sam and I experienced the same cold, fleeting touches, ever so gentle but profoundly unsettling. The real terror, though, began with the sightings. One evening, while we were all relaxing in the living room, I noticed a shadowy figure peering in through the window. I jumped up, thinking someone was trying to break in, but as I moved closer, the figure seemed to melt away into the night. Sam saw it too, confirming I wasn't just seeing things. From that point on, the figure haunted us, watching from the windows, always just at the edge of our vision, disappearing whenever we tried to confront it. The worst night of our lives in that house started just like any other. We had gathered in the kitchen for a late dinner. Plates and cutlery clattered as we joked about the house being haunted, nervously laughing off our fear. It was around midnight when things took a turn. As we sat eating, the temperature in the room plummeted. Our breath became visible, hanging in the air like smoke. The kitchen light flickered, casting erratic shadows all around us. Then, without warning, the pantry door flew open, and various canned goods and packages of dried food began to hurl themselves off the shelves. We stared in shock as they smashed against the walls and floor, clattering and some even opening from the force. Amid the chaos, a high-pitched, blood-curdling shriek filled the air, echoing throughout the house, like something from the depths of a nightmare. We bolted from the kitchen, only to find the hallway blocked by that same shadowy figure. It loomed larger than ever, a dark mass with indistinct features, but a very real presence. The air felt thick with hatred and malice radiating from us, so much so that it was almost tangible. We hesitated for a second that felt like an eternity, then bolted for the back door, leaving behind everything but our need to escape. We never spent another night in that house. We called the landlord the next morning, demanding an immediate termination of our lease. Surprisingly, or perhaps not, they didn't argue. We managed to find temporary accommodation with friends and eventually secured a new place, away from that cul-de-sac and any lingering spirits. Only later did we find out that that house had a history. Previous tenants had also left suddenly, some saying the place was haunted, others describing similar experiences to our own. It wasn't something the landlord ever mentioned, and perhaps it wasn't something they believed or wanted to believe. Living there changed us. We grew quieter, more introspective. I find myself glancing over my shoulder a lot more, half expecting to see a shadow peering back at me, even in the safety of my new home. Some nights, especially when it's quiet and the house is settling, I swear I can still hear those footsteps.
My encounter took place at a farmhouse in Lamington National Park, Queensland, Australia. The farmhouse is very old, around 100 years old, I think, and it was previously owned by the O'Reilly family, one of whom is famous for his rescue of the survivors of a crashed plane. The house is regularly rented out to holiday stayers, and I have stayed there on several occasions. On my last of these, several years ago, I swear I saw something, which I can only guess was a ghost. As anyone who has ever been in the country will know, it gets very dark at night. This, plus the layout of the house, made this a great place to play hide and seek in the dark. I was the seeker, and I decided to search in the main bedroom. There was a fire in the room opposite, so I could vaguely make out the contents of the room. However, as I entered, I suddenly stopped as, directly in front of me, a pitch-black shape appeared out of thin air. I cannot specifically describe the shape, as it didn't seem to have a distinct edge and it seemed to be constantly changing. It was, however, roughly my height and width. The thing itself, it was completely pitch black. Despite the fire behind me, I could make it out. I could also make out the contents of the room on either side of this thing. Almost as quickly as it appeared, a very dark red point of light, where I imagine its right eye would have been, appeared and began to glow brighter. At this point, I felt no fear, merely surprise and confusion at its sudden and unexpected appearance. I had never seen anything like this before. I did, however, decide that I no longer wanted to enter that room, and so I quickly walked backwards out of there. As I did so, the red eye began to fade again, and the entire thing vanished. After having explored the rest of the house and finding all but one of the hiders, I decided that it was time to search the main bedroom again. This time, no strange shape challenged me, and I quickly found that the last hider was on top of the wardrobe. Thinking that what I had seen might have possibly been him, I asked if he had been there the entire game, to which he said he had. It was also obvious that there could have been no way for him to have gotten up or down off that wardrobe without making enough noise for me to hear him from anywhere else in the house. It is only a small house, but it is very cluttered and very rickety. The floor creaks at every step. I don't know what it is I saw that night, and I honestly have no interest in finding out. I just wanted to share my experience with others. It was strange, and it makes a great campfire story.
When I was 10, my life changed in ways I could never have imagined. My father inherited an old house in remote New South Wales from a distant relative we barely knew. He thought it would be an idyllic place to raise a family, away from the hustle and bustle of city life. Little did he know what awaited us. The house was nestled in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense bushland. It was the perfect picture of tranquility, at least during the day. The house itself had an eerie, antiquated charm, with creaking floorboards and dimly lit hallways that seemed to stretch on forever. My family consisted of my father, my mother, my older sister Lucy, and me. We moved in with excitement and a sense of adventure, unaware of the horrors that would unfold. The first few nights were uneventful. My father busied himself with repairs, my mother unpacked, and Lucy and I explored the property. On the fourth night, I had my first encounter. I was in my room, reading a book, when I felt a sudden chill. The room seemed darker than usual, and I had the unmistakable feeling of being watched. I looked up, and there, peering around the corner of the doorframe, was a figure. It was barely visible, like a shadow, but I could make out the shape of a head and shoulders. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure remained there for a few agonizing moments before disappearing. I convinced myself it was my imagination, despite the creeping fear that settled into my bones. Weeks passed, and odd things continued to happen, mostly to me. My toys would be moved around. My bed would occasionally shake in the middle of the night. I told my parents, but they dismissed it as nightmares or childish imagination. One night I woke up to a whispering voice, hissing my name. I sat up drenched in sweat and saw the same figure from before, now at the foot of my bed. It was closer, clearer. It had no features, just an inky blackness. But as I stared at it, I noticed the whites of its eyes. I screamed, and my mother rushed in. The figure vanished the moment she opened the door, leaving her to comfort me and dismiss it as a bad dream. It wasn't until Lucy had her own experience that my parents began to take things seriously. She came to me one morning, pale and shaken, saying she'd seen a woman in old-fashioned clothes standing at the foot of her bed, staring at her with hollow eyes. My parents started to believe something was off, but didn't want to admit that something supernatural might be happening. Our situation escalated over the 5 years we lived there. It started small. Lights flickering, strange noises, cold drafts, but grew increasingly malicious. Here are two of the most chilling experiences that I remember vividly. The first event happened during our second year. My father had gone into town, leaving the rest of us alone. It was a stormy night, and the house seemed alive with its own energy. Lucy and I were in the living room, trying to watch TV despite the frequent flickers of power. Suddenly, the room went ice cold, and the TV turned off entirely. The next moment, the corner of the room darkened, and we both saw it. An unmistakable figure peering out from the shadows, its eyes catching the little light that remained. It slowly moved closer, and we could make out the shape of its mouth, twisted into a cruel smile. Lucy grabbed my hand, and we bolted upstairs to my parents' room, locking the door behind us. My mother tried to calm us down, but she too felt the coldness and unease that permeated the house. Another terrifying event occurred in our 4th year. My father had been more open to the idea that something was wrong. He brought in a local priest to bless the house after numerous pleas from my mother. That night, after the blessing, I was in the kitchen getting a drink of water when I felt a presence behind me. I turned and saw the same figure that had haunted me for years, now clearer than ever. It was a man, gaunt and hollow-eyed, with one side of his face hideously scarred. He stood at the entrance to the kitchen, blocking my exit. I was paralyzed with fear. He began to move towards me, slowly, deliberately, and every step he took, he seemed to drain the warmth from the room. I fell to the floor, unable to move, only managing to scream when he was inches away. My father burst in, and the figure vanished, leaving the air thick with dread. The priest's blessing had stirred whatever malevolence resided there. In our final year, things became unbearable. The entire family started hearing voices, footsteps, and seeing the figure, now bolder and more frequent in its appearances. It seemed to thrive on our fear, growing stronger and more aggressive. Doors would slam, objects would fly across the room, and we all felt watched all the time. We decided enough was enough. One evening, as we packed our things to leave, the activity reached a fever pitch. The house shook, the temperature dropped to freezing, and all of us saw shadows darting around. It seemed the entity didn't want us to go, but we were resolute. We moved out the next day, leaving behind that cursed house and never looking back. We learned later the house had a dark history indeed. The man who built it, in the mid-1800s, was rumored to have gone mad and killed his family. His spirit, along with others, was said to haunt the property, reliving their final moments in a twisted loop of torment. We never spoke of it much after we left, but the memories linger. Even now, years later, sometimes I wake up in the dead of night, half expecting to see a face peering around the corner, watching and waiting. Hello watchers and listeners, thank you so much for watching. If you have a story to share, please send it to my email in the description below. This channel is mostly made up of stories sent in by viewers or people they know. Another way to support the channel is to sign up for my Patreon, where you can watch my videos ad-free. More perks will be added in the new year. Also, I will be adding new designs to the merch store, so keep an eye out for that. Thank you all for your continuous support, and remember,